at 44 years old. Naomi Colby owned nothing in the world but the clothes on her back, a tin cup, and $11 wrapped in a handkerchief that had belonged to a husband 9 years dead. It was her own brother-in-law, Silas Colby, who had ridden her up into the high country on a gray spring morning, promising to show her the new boundary markers on the family claim, and left her there in a whiteout with no fire and no trail home, certain the mountain would finish what he lacked the nerve to finish himself. She had no house, no name the county still recognized, and no kin left who would claim her at the door. So when the auctioneer in the town of Larkspur Hollow called out the old frost-trapping cabin, abandoned near Silverfork Pass for 25 years and considered worthless by every soul present, Naomi raised her hand and paid $9 for it, and the whole room believed grief had finally taken what little sense she had left. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that sealed inside those crooked log walls lay a secret that would restore not only her name, but the entire town that had given her up for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Colby. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, the way Naomi once did, tell us where you're watching from tonight, and let us know we are not so far apart as it seems. Naomi Vesey was born in 1853 in a narrow river valley in southern Ohio, the third daughter of a furrier named Hiram Vesey, a quiet, deliberate man who kept a trading post at the crossing of two wagon roads and who believed, with the kind of conviction most men reserve for scripture, that nothing in this world was without worth if you knew how to look at it properly. He taught his daughters to read a fur the way other fathers taught their sons to read weather, the density of the underdown, the sheen along the guard hairs, the telltale nick of a poorly set trap that ruined a pelt's value to a careless eye but meant nothing at all to a patient one. Naomi was the only one of the three girls who took to it. She would sit for hours at her father's counter while trappers came down out of the hills with bundles slung over mule backs, and she learned to separate the merely damaged from the truly worthless, a distinction her father insisted most men never bothered to make in their whole lives, whether they were talking about pelts or about people. He taught her his ledger system too, a private shorthand of marks and tallies that let him track debts, trades, and the small kindnesses he extended to families who could not pay, kindnesses he never spoke of but always recorded, because he said a debt of the heart was still a debt, and deserved to be remembered even if it was never called in. Naomi kept his books from the age of 12. She learned patience at that counter, and she learned humility, watching hard men weep quietly over a winter's work destroyed by a single careless cut, and she learned above all that value was not something the world assigned to a thing, but something a person had to be willing to see. When she was 23, a soft-spoken Colorado rancher named Silas Colby came through the valley buying breeding stock and stayed 3 weeks longer than his business required, and by the time he left, he had asked Hiram Vesey for his daughter's hand, and Hiram had given it, though not without warning Elias that his girl had a trapper's eye and a trapper's stubbornness, and that a man who tried to manage her the way he might manage a herd would find himself sorely disappointed. Elias only laughed and said that was exactly the wife he was hoping for. They married in the autumn of 1876 and traveled west together into the high valleys below the Sawtooth Range, where Elias held a modest cattle spread and a small silver interest. He worked more out of stubborn hope than any real expectation, in the shadow of a settlement called Larkspur Hollow, a town of perhaps 400 souls scattered along a fast creek at 8,000 feet, ringed by peaks that held snow 11 months of the year. It was a hard, beautiful, unforgiving country, and Naomi loved it immediately and completely, the way she had loved the smell of raw hide and wood smoke her whole life, and she set about making herself useful in every way the town would allow, keeping books for the mercantile in the slow season, doctoring minor wounds with the poultices her father had taught her, and quietly building, over 12 years, a name for herself as a woman whose word and whose ledger could both be trusted absolutely. Elias's older brother, Silas, had come out to Colorado 2 years ahead of them and had never quite forgiven the mountains for failing to make him rich as fast as he believed he deserved. Where Elias was content with a modest herd and a modest life, Silas wanted more of everything, more land, more standing, more say in the affairs of Larkspur Hollow, where he had already positioned himself on the town council and cultivated a friendship with Warren Pruitt, the only banker for 60 miles, a soft-handed man who held the paper on nearly every struggling claim in the valley. Naomi never trusted Silas, not from the first handshake, though she could not have said precisely why beyond the way his eyes moved over a room totaling its worth rather than its people. Elias, generous to a fault, extended his brother partnership in the ranch and a share in the silver claim, a decision Naomi quietly opposed and was quietly overruled on, and for a decade the arrangement held, uneasy but functional, the way a poorly set beam holds a roof until the exact winter it chooses to fail. That failure came in the spring of 1888, when a shaft collapse at the small silver working took Silas Colby's life in an instant, burying him under 40 feet of rock while Naomi was 3 miles away boiling wash water and humming a hymn she would never be able to hear again without her hands beginning to shake. She was 35 years old, and she buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the ranch he had built, and she believed, in the raw and terrible weeks that followed, that grief was the worst thing the mountains would ever ask her to survive. She was wrong. Silas moved quickly. Within a month he had filed papers asserting that the ranch and the claim had always been intended to pass to him as Elias's business partner and nearest male relation, papers Naomi had never seen or signed, notarized by a clerk who happened to owe Warren Pruitt's bank a debt he could not otherwise repay. She fought it as best she could with no money for a lawyer and no family within 1,000 miles, and it was in the midst of that fight, on a gray morning in April, that Silas rode up to the ranch house and told her, gently, convincingly, that a survey crew had found the true boundary markers a half-day's ride up into the high meadows, and that if she came with him and witnessed the corner stake herself, it would settle the matter of the claim once and for all in her favor. She believed him, because she had no reason yet not to, and because some stubborn hope in her still wanted to believe that her husband's brother could not truly be as small a man as her instincts warned her he was. He led her up switchbacks she did not know, through timber that grew thinner and darker, until the sky itself seemed to close overhead in gray wool, and somewhere above 11,000 feet, with snow beginning to needle sideways out of a sky that had been clear an hour before, he told her to wait by a rock outcropping while he rode ahead to find the marker, and he did not come back. She waited 3 hours before she understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, that he was not coming back at all, that the survey crew did not exist, that she had been led into the high country to die where no one would ever find her body and no one would ever have to answer for it. She should have died. By every reasonable measure of that country and that storm, she should have frozen before nightfall, one more woman the mountains simply kept. She did not die, though it would be many years before she could say exactly why. She built what shelter she could against the outcropping with pine boughs cut with a belt knife her father had given her, and she kept her hands moving through the worst of the night out of pure trained habit, working knots and braiding cordage the way she had as a girl, because idle hands, her father always said, were the first thing the cold took. A pair of Ute elk hunters found her 2 days later, half frozen and raving, farther down the drainage than she had any memory of traveling, and they carried her to a line camp and nursed her back with a patience and a generosity she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. By the time she was strong enough to travel, word had already reached Larkspur Hollow that Naomi Colby had perished of exposure searching for her husband's grave in her grief, a story Silas told with such convincing sorrow that the town had already held a small memorial service in her name. She arrived back at the edge of town 2 weeks later, thin and scarred and utterly changed, only to learn that Silas had already recorded her death with the county, taken full title to the ranch and the claim under that fraudulent transfer, and remarried within the year to a woman from Denver who did not know, or chose not to ask, what had become of the first Mrs. Colby's sister-in-law arrangement. Naomi had no money for a lawyer, no living witness to what had happened on that mountain, and a county record that already listed her as deceased. To fight him openly, she understood with a clarity that felt like a second kind of death, was to risk whatever Silas Colby was capable of a second time, and this time he would not make the mistake of leaving her a fighting chance. So she did the only thing that felt like survival. She left Larkspur Hollow, took modest work as a seamstress and ledger-keeper in towns up and down the valley under her maiden name, and spent 9 long years rebuilding a life from nothing while the town she loved went on believing her dead. She came back to Larkspur Hollow in the autumn of 1897, not because she had found her courage exactly, but because her father's oldest friend, a retired trapper named Amos Kettle who had known her as a girl, had written to say he was dying and wished to see her once more before the end, and because some part of her, 9 years buried, wanted simply to stand once more in the valley where she had been happy. Amos passed peacefully within the week, and Naomi found herself lingering in the boarding house at the edge of town, unwilling to leave and unsure why, watching from a careful distance as Silas Colby, now the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties and a fixture of the town council, moved through Larkspur Hollow like a man who had never left a single debt unpaid, when in truth he had never paid the one that mattered most. It was in that boarding house, reading a 3-day-old county notice pinned to the wall advertising a tax auction of abandoned properties, that her eye caught a small listing near the bottom of the page, the old frost-line cabin, high above Silverfork Pass, delinquent on its taxes for 25 years, to be sold to the highest bidder for whatever the county could recover. She had heard the name Jedediah Frost before, as a girl might hear the name of any local ghost story, a trapper who had vanished into the mountains a generation before and never been seen again, and something in her, some old instinct trained at her father's counter to notice what other people overlooked, told her to attend the auction the following morning. The auction itself lasted less than 10 minutes and drew perhaps a dozen bidders, most of them there for a parcel of grazing land 2 lots down, and when the auctioneer finally reached the Frost cabin, reading its description in the flat, bored voice of a man reciting something he expected no one to want, a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small crowd. The cabin was said to be falling in on itself, accessible only by a game trail above 10,000 feet, and haunted, several of the older townsfolk insisted without any trace of irony, by the ghost of old Frost himself, who had gone strange in his final years, muttering about a fortune no one had ever seen a single dust speck of, before he simply stopped coming down for supplies one autumn and was never seen again. The opening bid was $2. Naomi raised her hand before she had entirely decided to, and when the bidding stalled at $9 against a rancher who only wanted the water rights and quickly lost interest, the cabin became hers for a sum that emptied more than 3/4 of everything she owned in the world. She caught Silas Colby's eye across the room as she signed the county paper, and watched something flicker across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite alarm, but close enough to both that she felt, for the first time in 9 years, the cold certainty that she had been right never to trust him, and the strange, unfamiliar warmth of no longer being entirely powerless in his presence. It took her the better part of 2 days to climb to the cabin with a borrowed mule and a pack of provisions she could barely afford, following a trail so faint in places that she had to trust her father's old instinct for reading disturbed ground more than any marked path. The cabin, when she finally reached it in the thin blue light of a mountain evening, was smaller and more forlorn than she had pictured, its roof sagging under 2.5 decades of snow load, its door hanging by a single leather hinge that had somehow, stubbornly, refused to rot through entirely. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold ash and something else beneath it, a faint animal must that spoke of 100 winters of fur cured and stacked and shipped down the mountain by a man who had, by every account, lived and worked entirely alone. She spent that first night simply making the single room habitable, sweeping out packrat nests and stopping the worst of the gaps in the chinking with rags, and it was not until the second morning, moving a fallen shelf to clear space for a cook fire, that her hand found a groove in the floorboard beneath it that did not belong to any natural warp of the wood. She knelt and worked her belt knife into the seam the way her father had taught her to work a blade beneath a poorly cured hide, gently, without forcing, feeling for where the wood wanted to give rather than where she wanted it to, and after a long, patient quarter hour, a section of floorboard the length of her forearm lifted free to reveal a shallow cavity lined with oiled canvas gone stiff and brittle with age. Inside lay a single object, wrapped with the meticulous care of a man who had clearly expected, or at least hoped, that someone would one day find it, a small tin box, rusted at its seams but sealed tight, and inside that, folded in waxed paper that had preserved it remarkably well against a quarter-century of mountain damp, a single page torn from a larger journal, written in a cramped, careful hand and dated the 14th of September, 1871. The page was not, in itself, an explanation. It read more like the fragment of a longer confession, written perhaps in haste or in fear, describing a man's growing conviction that he was being watched and followed on his trips down to town, and his decision to stop trusting the bank with anything further, ending mid-sentence with a line that stopped Naomi's breath entirely. What is owed to this town will be paid, whether the town ever knows my name again or not. And it is hidden where only a true furrier's eye will ever find it. She sat on the cabin floor for a long while after reading it, the tin box balanced on her knees, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman who has spent 9 years believing herself entirely alone in the world, suddenly finding evidence that someone else, a generation before her, in this same remote and forgotten place, had once felt exactly as hunted, and exactly as determined not to let that hunting be the end of the story. Over the following weeks, working the cabin by day and returning to the boarding house in town only when supplies demanded it, Naomi pieced together the shape of Jedediah Frost's life the way she had once pieced together the history of a damaged pelt, one careful observation at a time. She found, tucked behind a loose stone in the chimney, 3 more journal pages that had survived where the rest of his writing had not, and from the fragments of Larkspur Hollow's own memory, still alive in its oldest residents if one knew gently how to ask, a fuller picture began to take shape. Jedediah Frost had come into the valley in the 1850s, one of the last of the old mountain trappers working the region as the fur trade itself was dying around him, and he had built a modest but real fortune over 2 decades of relentless frugality, banking his earnings not with the town's only financial institution but in gold dust and coin he trusted to no one but himself, a habit that made him seem eccentric to his neighbors but which, Naomi now understood, had likely saved that fortune from ever passing through Otis Pruitt's hands. Warren Pruitt's father, who had run the Larkspur Hollow Bank in those years with the same soft, calculating patience his son would later inherit. The town's oldest surviving resident, a former schoolteacher named Cordelia Ashby, now nearly 80 and delighted to have a curious visitor, told Naomi over tea what she remembered of the winter of 1870, when a diphtheria outbreak had swept through Larkspur Hollow and killed 11 children in a single terrible season, in a town with no doctor, no proper clinic, and no money in its meager relief fund to send for one in time. Jedediah Frost, Cordelia recalled, had lost his own young daughter in that outbreak, and had come down from the mountains afterward a changed and grimmer man, telling anyone who would listen that no child in that valley should ever again die for want of a doctor's fee, and that he intended to see the town build a proper clinic and school if it was the last thing he accomplished with his life. He had approached Otis Pruitt, Cordelia believed, about establishing some kind of trust for exactly that purpose, and shortly afterward had begun behaving strangely, growing suspicious of visitors, moving his trapping operations to ever more remote line camps, and finally, in the autumn of 1872, simply failing to come down from the mountains at all. The town had assumed, over the years, that the old stories of his hidden fortune were exactly that, stories, the kind of legend that attaches itself naturally to any solitary man who dies unwitnessed in wild country, and that if Frost had ever truly had money, it had likely been squandered, lost, or simply never existed outside his own increasingly troubled imagination in his final lonely years. Naomi did not believe that, not after reading his own hand describe a fortune hidden where only a true furrier's eye would find it, and not after 2 more weeks of patient, methodical searching that drew directly on every lesson her father had ever taught her at that trading post counter in Ohio. She searched the cabin the way she had once searched a bundle of pelts for the one hide worth more than the trader offering to buy it understood, running her hands along seams, testing weight and give, distrusting anything that looked too ordinary to have survived 25 years of mountain weather without more decay than it showed. It was the stack of old bundled pelts in the cabin's low loft, dismissed by every previous visitor, if there had been any, as worthless moth-eaten refuse not worth the trouble of hauling down the mountain, that finally gave up their secret. Naomi noticed, running her fingers over the bundles the way her father had taught her to read a fur's true quality beneath its surface condition, that several of them had been resewn along a seam that did not match a trapper's typical stitching, a tighter, more deliberate line of thread that spoke of purpose rather than repair. She opened the first with trembling hands to find, nestled inside the ruined fur, a small oiled leather pouch heavy with gold dust and nuggets, and beneath that, wrapped in still more waxed paper, a full accounting in Frost's own hand of a fortune accumulated over 20 years of trapping and careful placer work along a creek bend he called, with quiet, aching irony, Widow's Run, a sum that came, by her careful count over the following days, to just under $9,000 in gold and coin, along with a final letter addressed to no one in particular and everyone in Larkspur Hollow at once, stating plainly his wish that the fortune be used to build the town a proper clinic and school, so that no family in that valley would ever again bury a child for want of what money could have bought. Word travels quickly in a small mountain town, even word a woman means to keep quiet, and it was perhaps inevitable that within a month of her discovery, rumor of gold found at the old frost cabin had reached every corner of Larkspur Hollow, growing larger and stranger with each retelling until Silas Colby himself rode up the mountain trail one crisp October afternoon, uninvited, to see for himself what his sister-in-law, whom the entire town still believed had died of grief 9 years before, had actually found. Naomi met him on the cabin porch with a steadiness that surprised them both, and watched the color drain from his face as he finally understood, standing there in the thin mountain light, that the woman he had left to die in a storm had not died at all, and had returned with a discovery that threatened everything he had spent 9 years building on the foundation of that lie. He did not threaten her outright, not at first. He was too careful a man for that, and too aware, standing on a mountainside with no witnesses, of exactly how such a confrontation might look a second time. Instead he offered to buy the cabin and its contents from her outright, at a price that would have made her comfortable for the rest of her life and that she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, was meant primarily to make her disappear quietly a second time, to take the money and leave the valley and never force the town or its records to reconcile the fact that Naomi Colby was alive with the fact that Silas Colby had built his fortune on the belief that she was not. She refused him, gently and without anger, and told him that the money was never hers to sell, that it belonged to a promise an old man had made to a valley full of children he had failed to save, and that she intended to see it kept. Silas's face, in that moment, lost whatever warmth it had ever pretended to hold, and he told her, in a voice gone quiet and flat, that a woman with no legal existence, a woman the county had recorded dead 9 years prior, would find it very difficult indeed to convince a judge that either the cabin or its contents were legally hers to give away, and that he intended to contest her claim to both. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the mountain itself had been, because this fight took place not in a blizzard but in the town's small courthouse and in the whispered conversations of neighbors deciding, one household at a time, whether to believe a woman risen from the dead or a man who had spent 9 years quietly buying their loyalty with grazing leases and easy credit at Warren Pruitt's bank. Silas filed papers disputing both her identity and her title, arguing through a lawyer brought up from Denver that the cabin's contents, being found on land whose taxes had gone unpaid for a generation, rightfully belonged to the county and, by extension, to whoever had legitimately purchased the property. A claim he suggested privately to certain council members was itself questionable given the seller's uncertain legal standing. Warren Pruitt, for his part, quietly called in notes on 3 separate businesses in town whose owners had spoken too openly in support of Naomi, a form of pressure so common in Larkspur Hollow that most residents recognized it instantly for what it was and said nothing further, out of the same fear that had kept the town silent about a great many things for a great many years. It was Cordelia Ashby, in the end, who turned the tide, standing up at a town meeting called to discuss the disputed claim and reminding the room, in a voice that had once commanded 30 schoolchildren into silence and had lost none of its authority, that she herself had taught young Naomi Vesey's letters when the girl first arrived in this valley as a bride, and that no amount of legal maneuvering by a man who had once ridden alone into the mountains with his brothers, widow and ridden back down alone again would ever convince her that the coincidence required innocence. Other voices followed, quietly at first and then with growing confidence, neighbors who had wondered privately for 9 years about the convenient speed of Silas Colby's rise and had simply lacked, until now, anyone brave enough to say the thought aloud in public. Naomi herself produced what evidence she had gathered in the intervening weeks, working with a young circuit lawyer who agreed to take her case on the promise of future payment, Frost's own journal pages establishing the fortune's origin and clear intent, testimony from the Ute hunters who had found her, still living within riding distance and willing at last to speak, and a written account from Amos Kettle's widow of conversations her late husband had shared about the day, 9 years before, when Naomi Colby had staggered into their line camp half frozen with a story about her brother-in-law that Amos had believed entirely and had regretted, on his deathbed, never having found the courage to make public. The county judge who finally heard the matter in the first week of December was not a sentimental man, but even he could not ignore the weight of accumulated testimony set against Silas Colby's increasingly thin denials, and in a ruling that took the town by storm, he restored Naomi's legal identity, voided the fraudulent transfer of the original Colby ranch on grounds of documented fraud, and affirmed her clear and undisputed title to the Frost cabin and everything found within it. Silas Colby did not go to prison, for the law of that time and place was not built to punish a man for what he had done on a mountainside with no witness, but he lost, within the span of a single winter, nearly everything he had spent 9 years accumulating. The ranch reverted to Naomi, the town council quietly declined to renew his seat, and Warren Pruitt, sensing the direction the valley's loyalty had turned, distanced himself from his old partner with the same cold efficiency he had once used to call in loans, leaving Silas to face the spring alone in a town that had finally, fully, remembered exactly what kind of man he was. Naomi did not take the fortune for herself, not $1 beyond what she needed to settle the debts of the fight itself, and in the spring of 1898 she stood before the town council, in the same room where Silas Colby had once held quiet sway, and laid out Jedediah Frost's final letter for every resident of Larkspur Hollow to read in his own hand. His wish that no child in that valley ever again die for want of a doctor, and she pledged the whole of the found fortune, nearly $9,000, to the building of a proper clinic and a schoolhouse on land she donated herself from the restored Colby Ranch. Construction began that summer, and by the following autumn Larkspur Hollow had, for the first time in its history, a resident doctor paid for 3 years running, and a schoolhouse with real glass windows and a bell that rang out over the valley each morning, and above its door, at Naomi's quiet insistence, a small carved plaque bearing not her own name but 2 others together, Jedediah Frost, who kept his promise a generation late, and every child of Larkspur Hollow, for whom it was always meant. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, a woman of 44 with nothing in her handkerchief but $11, standing in a room full of people who believed she had lost her sense entirely for spending 9 of those dollars on a ruined cabin no one else would touch. What none of them understood in that moment, and what Naomi herself could not have known, was that the very qualities that had made her seem foolish to that room, her patience, her willingness to look closely at what everyone else had already dismissed, her father's old conviction that nothing in this world is without worth if you know how to look at it properly, were the exact qualities that would let her see what a generation of careless eyes had walked past entirely. She had been left for dead once by a man who mistook her for something disposable, and she had spent 9 years quietly proving, first to herself and finally to an entire valley, that he had been wrong. The fortune she found was never really about gold. It was about a promise kept a generation late, and a woman who understood, better than almost anyone in that town, what it costs to be written off, and what it means, finally, to be seen. Thank you for spending this evening with Naomi Colby, and with the valley she helped restore. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs a reminder that what the world calls worthless is very often only waiting for the right person to look closely enough to see otherwise, and we'd love for you to leave us a comment and tell us this. What is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and we're grateful, truly, that you chose to spend this time with us. Until next time, stay close.